It started as a quiet morning, the kind where everything feels routine. I stepped outside to check my property after a night of heavy rain, expecting the usual puddles and damp soil. But what I saw stopped me cold. Water wasn't draining properly. My drain, the one I had carefully maintained for years, was completely blocked, and it wasn't by accident. I followed the line of water and quickly realized the unmistakable truth. Someone had tampered with it. Then I noticed the familiar orange vehicle parked suspiciously near the source of the blockage.
Karen.
Of course it was her. The same HOA Karen who had been trying to assert authority over my property for months. I could practically see the smug satisfaction in her posture. She believed that by blocking my drain, she could punish me or force me into some HOA compliance scheme. It was petty, deliberate, and infuriating. I walked closer, observing the obstruction. Branches, debris, and even some small stones had been arranged in a way that stopped water completely. The rainwater pooled around my property, threatening to spill into my yard. The anger inside me simmered, not just at the inconvenience, but at the principle.
Who does that?
Who deliberately tampers with someone else's property because of entitlement and personal vendettas. I pulled out my phone immediately. Documentation was key. Photos, videos, timestamps, and angles, I captured everything. If the HOA tried to deny involvement, the evidence would speak louder than any argument. My neighbors, sensing the tension, began peeking out of their windows. Whispers floated across fences. Is that Karen again? She's done it this time. Even people who had seen Karen's antics before seemed taken aback by the sheer audacity of this move. Minutes later, I noticed the water level rising, and my mind raced. Karen wasn't just trying to inconvenience me. She was attempting to create a scenario where I might appear negligent or responsible for flooding elsewhere. That thought gave me an idea. If she wanted to play games with drainage and control, I would respond, but carefully. There would be no rash moves, no direct confrontation. This was about strategy, observation, and the perfect response. I moved to higher ground on my property and began reviewing the situation. The rain was relentless, water pooling rapidly behind the obstruction. I checked the layout of the surrounding properties. And then it hit me. Karen's own house was downhill, directly in line with where the water had to flow. If the drain continued to be blocked, her property was the natural collection point. The thought made my stomach twist with anticipation and a strange satisfaction. Sometimes, natural consequences are the most effective teachers. I returned to documenting the situation. A wide-angle shot of the obstruction, a close-up of the debris clearly not washed in by rain, and a time-lapse sequence showing the water steadily building behind the blockage. Each photo told a story of intent. Each video captured the inevitability of what was to come. Karen, oblivious, stood in her yard, checking her phone and laughing with her friends, thinking she had cleverly inconvenienced me without any risk to herself. I knew that if I stayed patient, the law of cause and effect would handle the rest. And as I recorded, I reminded myself, this wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching a lesson without violating the law, about documenting overreach, and about ensuring that Karen's entitlement would meet the natural consequences of her own actions. The rain continued to pour, water rising steadily, and I waited calmly, knowing that the moment of reckoning was approaching and that the community would witness it all. By mid-morning, the situation had escalated in ways that even I hadn't fully anticipated. The blocked drain had caused water to pool rapidly across my property, and it was clear that Karen's interference was having far-reaching effects. I could see the water beginning to creep toward the low-lying area directly in front of her house. The realization hit me. If the blockage wasn't addressed immediately, the overflow would naturally follow gravity, and her property was perfectly positioned to receive it. I documented everything meticulously. Photos of the obstruction, video of the water rising, timestamps showing the exact progression. Each detail was captured. Neighbors, alerted by the unusual water buildup, were beginning to gather across the street and along the sidewalks. Some whispered anxiously to each other. Others quietly recorded the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of anticipation, disbelief, and excitement. Karen appeared unaware of the impending consequences. She was on her phone, talking loudly to someone, likely a fellow HOA member, laughing and gesturing as though she had already won. The arrogance in her movements reminded me of every previous encounter. The way she assumed authority, the way she believed her petty actions had no accountability. But this time, the stage had shifted. The power of nature, combined with careful observation, was about to teach a lesson far more effective than any verbal confrontation. I began moving strategically to higher ground, staying out of the worst of the water while monitoring the flow. Each moment, the water inched closer to the property line. I noted the angles, the slope, and the natural drainage path that led directly toward Karen's backyard. It was almost poetic. Her attempt to control my property through obstruction was being mirrored by the law of physics itself. Neighbors began commenting softly among themselves. "Look at that, it's going right toward her yard," one whispered. Another murmured, "I think she didn't expect this." I kept my attention on documenting everything: the debris blocking the drain, the water buildup, the trajectory, and the surrounding properties. Every angle reinforced the inevitability of what was about to happen. The evidence was undeniable, and if any HOA claims of innocence were made later, it would be impossible to dispute the sequence of events. Karen finally noticed the rising water, and her expression shifted from smugness to mild concern. She glanced toward her yard, and for the first time, there was hesitation in her stance. Her phone was still in hand, but her confidence had wavered. She made a few half-hearted gestures toward the blockage, but it was too late. The natural flow of water was already working against her. The crowd of neighbors had grown slightly, their quiet presence reinforcing the accountability she had tried to avoid. I stayed calm, knowing that the lesson didn't need to be forced. There was no shouting, no confrontation, just patient observation and careful documentation. Every second of the water's movement told the story: HOA overreach, arrogance, and entitlement meeting the unavoidable consequences of natural law. Karen's attempts to regain control were becoming increasingly futile. By the time the water began to touch the edge of her property, her panic became noticeable. She stepped outside, looking around, realizing for the first time that the situation was escalating beyond anything she had planned. She waved her hands and shouted at me, but it was too late. There was no legal or social argument that could prevent what was already in motion. The scene was tense, dramatic, and undeniable. The obstruction had caused a problem, and the consequences were now obvious to everyone watching. The stage was set for a dramatic payoff. Karen's arrogance had met physics, patience, and careful documentation. The neighbors, the rising water, and the looming flood of her backyard all combined into a moment of accountability that would be remembered long after the rain stopped. By early afternoon, the consequences of the blocked drain were becoming impossible to ignore. Water from my property had pooled behind the obstruction for hours, and the natural slope of the land now funneled it directly toward Karen's backyard. I watched from a safe distance as small streams of water began creeping across the boundary line. The reality of what was happening was starting to dawn on her. Karen stepped out of her house, her face a mix of disbelief and panic. She waved her arms frantically, calling out to me, demanding that I do something. But there was nothing to do. The water's path was dictated by physics, not by her demands or her previous attempts at intimidation. I remained calm, documenting every moment. Photos of the streams reaching her flower beds, short video clips capturing the rise of water toward her back patio. Every frame told the story of her overreach meeting its natural consequence. The neighbors who had been watching quietly began to murmur among themselves. Some pointed discreetly toward Karen's yard, others whispered encouragement to me. "She blocked your drain. Now she's getting what she deserved," one neighbor said softly. Another added, "Finally, she's learning consequences." The collective attention made Karen increasingly uneasy. Her confident demeanor was gone, replaced by defensive gestures and hurried phone calls. By now, water had entered her yard in small pools, soaking the grass and edging closer to the foundation of her home. Karen tried to act quickly, attempting to redirect the flow with whatever she could grab: plastic buckets, garden hoses, even patio furniture, but it was too late. The volume of water was more than she could manage, and the flow had already reached the lower edge of her property. The inevitability of the situation became obvious to everyone watching. I remained strategically positioned on my property, staying dry and safe, while observing the unfolding scene. My camera captured every second, Karen scrambling to contain the water, her shouting growing more frantic, and the inevitable spread of water toward her house. The images would later serve as clear evidence that this was not negligence on my part, but a direct result of her actions. At this point, the flood had reached the edge of her patio and was beginning to seep toward her back door. Karen's face was a mixture of horror and frustration. She shouted at the neighbors, blaming them, me, the rain, and even the laws of physics. But no one responded. The crowd had learned to simply watch and document. It was the perfect blend of accountability and natural consequence. Some of the neighbors started recording videos with their phones, capturing Karen's frantic attempts to mitigate the flood. Others simply observed quietly, nodding at me in approval for staying calm and letting the situation unfold legally and safely. The lesson was clear to all. Entitlement and overreach have consequences, and trying to manipulate someone else's property can backfire spectacularly. By mid-afternoon, the water had crept fully into Karen's lower living area. Her attempts to bail it out were futile. The living room carpet was soaked, furniture slightly submerged, and the chaos complete. Neighbors gasped quietly at the sight, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the sheer audacity of her previous actions. Karen, meanwhile, realized the gravity of what she had done and how quickly her attempt at intimidation had turned against her. In that moment, it became clear that this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, consequences, and the natural balance of cause and effect. The flood was a direct, undeniable result of her interference. Every step she had taken to assert control over my property had led to this outcome. The dramatic payoff was now visible to everyone. The blocked drain, her frantic scramble, the rising water, and the undeniable lesson of entitlement meeting reality. By late afternoon, the situation had reached its peak drama. Karen's frantic attempts to redirect the water were completely ineffective. The living room of her house was partially flooded, the carpet soaked, furniture damp, and decorative items floating or waterlogged. The chaos she had tried to avoid now surrounded her, and the neighbors could see it all. Her aura of authority had completely vanished, replaced by panic and disbelief. Every move she had made to control the situation on my property had backfired spectacularly. I stayed calm on my property, keeping a safe distance, documenting everything with photos and video. Wide shots captured the full extent of the flood, showing the trajectory of the water from my yard to hers. Close-ups captured her futile attempts to mitigate the damage, plastic buckets, towels, and hoses, none of which made a noticeable difference. Every angle told the story. HOA overreach, petty vengeance, and the natural consequences of tampering with someone else's property. Neighbors continued to observe quietly, some filming discreetly, some whispering among themselves. They could see the justice unfolding before their eyes. Karen had long relied on the perception of authority, shouting, intimidating, and assuming compliance, but that illusion had now been shattered. She was no longer commanding attention through force, she was reacting to reality. Her frantic calls to the HOA board, her attempts to manipulate bystanders, all fell flat. Nature had enforced a lesson she hadn't expected. The attorney and friends I had called earlier arrived just as the flood reached its full extent inside her living room. They calmly assessed the situation, advising her that the damage she was experiencing was a direct consequence of her own actions. Karen attempted to argue, pointing at me and claiming that I had deliberately caused the flood, but the documentation was clear. The obstruction of my drain had caused the water to follow the natural slope to her property. Any reasonable court or mediator could see the direct cause and effect relationship. Karen's frustration became visible and vocal. She shouted at anyone nearby, accusing them of taking sides, but the crowd remained neutral, simply observing. The neighbors had already witnessed her pattern of entitlement and overreach, and now they saw the consequences laid bare. Her shouting did nothing to mitigate the damage, and in fact, made her appear even more unhinged. It was a powerful display. The law of cause and effect, backed by clear documentation, had spoken louder than any HOA mandate or Karen's personal authority. I stayed silent, observing, knowing that any confrontation beyond this point would be unnecessary. Her panic and her flooded living room were enough to make the lesson unforgettable. The water, moving according to the slope of the land, served as a natural teacher. Every frustrated gesture from Karen, every frantic attempt to salvage her possessions, highlighted the consequences of interfering with someone else's property. By the early evening, the flood had begun to stabilize. Water seeped into carpeting and furniture, causing damage, but it was no longer spreading uncontrollably. Karen finally retreated inside, phone in hand, calling emergency services and insurance companies, while the neighbors and I documented every detail for legal purposes. She had learned, perhaps too late, that attempting to control someone else's property through obstruction could have serious consequences. The standoff had ended, but the lesson lingered. HOA overreach, entitlement, and arrogance had met patience, observation, and natural consequence. The neighbors dispersed slowly, quietly discussing what they had witnessed. Karen remained inside, a mix of frustration, panic, and reflection written across her face. The flood wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about demonstrating the consequences of attempting to interfere with someone else's property. By the following morning, the aftermath of the flood had fully settled, leaving a neighborhood buzzing quietly with curiosity and whispered commentary. Karen's living room remained partially waterlogged, furniture slightly damaged, and carpet soaked. She was forced to face the reality that her petty attempt to control my property had backfired spectacularly. While I had remained calm throughout, documenting every detail, the flood had served as an unmistakable, tangible consequence of her interference. I walked through my yard, inspecting the drain that had been deliberately blocked. It was now clear and functioning as it should, letting the residual water flow safely away. I made a few final photos for records, ensuring that every moment from the obstruction to the flood was documented. These images would provide irrefutable evidence should Karen or the HOA attempt any legal counterclaims. For me, this was more than evidence. It was a reminder that patience, preparation, and knowing your rights are more powerful than rash reactions or intimidation. Karen finally emerged from her home, her face a mixture of frustration, embarrassment, and grudging respect for the undeniable sequence of events. She moved cautiously across the yard, making small gestures to signal she understood the lesson without admitting it openly. Her usual arrogance had been replaced by hesitation and careful observation. Even neighbors who had long tolerated her antics began nodding subtly in my direction, acknowledging that the outcome had been justified and deserved. The surrounding community had absorbed its own lessons. Conversations among neighbors shifted from gossip to understanding. People discussed property boundaries, rights, and accountability. The story of Karen's blocked drain and subsequent flooded living room became a cautionary tale. Overreach, entitlement, and attempts to control others' property would meet natural consequences and legal reality. Witnesses who had watched the drama unfold quietly documented it on phones and cameras, preserving the lesson visually for anyone tempted to follow Karen's example. I spent the rest of the day making sure the drain remained clear and reviewing the path of water flow. The satisfaction came not from the damage itself, but from the clarity of justice. Karen had attempted to assert dominance. The HOA had attempted to enforce control through petty obstruction, but patience, documentation, and a firm understanding of property law had restored balance. The lesson was public, observable, and impossible to deny. Entitlement has limits, and interference with someone else's property carries consequences. Over the following days, Karen became noticeably more cautious. Her attempts to intimidate neighbors or enforce her perceived authority diminished. She was quieter in meetings, less confident in confrontations, and more aware that the neighborhood was now watching. The HOA as a whole began to tread lightly, their previous strategies for exerting power now tempered by visible evidence that their tactics could easily backfire. The incident had shifted the neighborhood dynamics subtly but permanently. As for me, the experience reinforced a profound principle. Calm observation, preparation, and knowledge of one's rights are far more effective than anger or confrontation. The flood had been a natural consequence, not revenge, and it demonstrated the limits of entitlement in a way that words alone never could. My property remained intact, my rights unquestioned, and the neighbors had witnessed a clear example of justice unfolding without conflict escalation. By evening, the neighborhood was quiet again. Karen had retreated fully into her home, and the water had receded from her yard. The driveway and yard on my property were fully accessible, the drain cleared, and the balance restored. The entire incident had transformed what could have been a petty dispute into a vivid, unforgettable lesson about boundaries, accountability, and consequences. The flood would be talked about for weeks, a permanent reminder that HOA overreach meets natural law, and sometimes the results are unavoidable, visible, and perfectly fair.